Think about power for a second. Where does it come from? Most people will tell you it comes from armies, from kings, from vast territories and military might. But what if I told you that in the ancient world, there were cities that became more powerful and wealthier than the empires that surrounded them? Not because they conquered anything, not because they had bigger armies, but because merchants passing through their gates made them so incredibly rich that even emperors had to bow to their influence. How did a few trading posts in the middle of deserts and mountains become more important than the Han Dynasty, the Roman Empire, or the Persian kingdoms? That's the story we're diving into today. Let's start with the obvious question. What was the Silk Road? Well, the name is actually kind of misleading. It wasn't one road. It wasn't even primarily about silk. The Silk Road was actually a massive network of overland trade routes that wound across the entire Eurasian continent for thousands of miles. It started in China, snaked through Central Asia, cut through Persia, and eventually reached the Mediterranean and beyond. For nearly 1,500 years, from around the 2nd century BCE until the 15th century CE, this was the main artery of world commerce. This wasn't some minor trade network. This was the global supply chain of the ancient world. But here's the thing that makes this story actually interesting. Those routes didn't benefit the empires equally. The Chinese had the goods. The Romans had the gold. The Persians controlled sections of the route, but it was the cities sitting in the middle of nowhere, cities like Samarkand, Kashgar, Aleppo, and Baghdad, that ended up holding all the cards. How? Because controlling the flow of goods meant controlling wealth, and controlling wealth meant controlling power. And once you have that kind of power, empires become secondary to your interests. Before we get to how these cities became so powerful, we need to understand what they were selling. And this is crucial because these weren't just any goods. These were luxury items that people in the Western world were absolutely obsessed with. The Romans, they had everything they needed. They had grain, wine, military technology, and infrastructure. But what they wanted, what they craved, was Chinese silk. Pliny the Elder, a Roman writer, actually complained about it. He wasn't complaining because silk was ugly or poorly made. He was complaining because the Roman elite's appetite for silks was literally draining gold out of Rome. Roman women wanted these beautiful, delicate fabrics that only came from China, and they were willing to pay astronomical prices. So much gold was flowing east to pay for silk that Roman senators got worried that Rome was going to run out of money. But silk wasn't alone. Along those routes came Chinese porcelain, so fine and delicate that nothing in Europe could compare to it. Chinese paper and printing technology would eventually revolutionize how knowledge spread: tea, spices, perfumes, and precious gems. From the West came different things: horses, camels, honey, wine, and gold itself. Lots and lots of gold. But here's what made the cities rich. They were the middlemen. They didn't own the goods. They didn't manufacture most of them. They just stood in between the people who had the goods and the people who desperately wanted them, and they took a cut. This is where the story takes a turn. The geography of the Silk Road was brutal. You couldn't just load a caravan in Chang'an, that's modern-day Xi'an in China, and march straight to Rome. Absolutely not. The journey was insanely dangerous. You'd be traveling through deserts so vast and empty they could kill you in hours. You'd be climbing through mountain passes where bandits waited to rob you. You'd be crossing through territory controlled by tribes and kingdoms that might decide to take your entire caravan. A trip from China to the Mediterranean could easily take 6 months or longer. And that's if nothing went wrong. Usually, something went wrong. So traders needed places to stop. They needed to rest their animals, often camels, who were literally dying from exhaustion. They needed to sleep indoors. They needed to buy supplies. They needed to sell off some goods to raise cash for the next leg of the journey. They needed translators who spoke multiple languages. They needed security. They needed banking services to exchange one currency for another. And most importantly, they needed information. A merchant from China needed to know what prices were like in Persia. A trader from Rome needed to know if the route ahead was safe or if bandits had recently taken over. Cities grew up specifically to provide all these services. Caravanserais, basically roadside inns, became centers of commerce. Merchants could rest their animals in enclosed courtyards, sleep inside thick-walled fortifications, and make deals in the courtyard. Markets formed where specific goods were traded. The spice district was in one area, silks were sold in another, precious metals in another. These cities became incredibly specialized. They had professional translators. They had money changers who understood dozens of different currencies and coin systems. They had accountants who kept records of debts and payments. They developed banking systems where you could cash a letter of credit from one city in another city thousands of miles away. And here's the key. Because the merchants needed these cities, the cities could charge them a lot. Tax on the goods passing through, fees for using the caravanserais, commissions on the sales, currency exchange fees, security costs. These charges added up to serious money. And unlike conquest-based empires that had to spend enormous resources on armies and borders, these cities were basically printing money. Every single merchant who came through the gate was another transaction, another fee, another tax. Let's talk about specific cities, because this is where the story becomes almost absurd in how rich these places got. Let's start with Samarkand, located in modern-day Uzbekistan in the heart of Central Asia. Samarkand was founded over 2,700 years ago, but it hit its absolute peak during the Silk Road era. When the traveler Ibn Battuta visited in 1333, he described it as one of the greatest and finest of cities and the most perfect of them in beauty. That's not just flowery language. That's a man who had traveled extensively and was genuinely impressed. By the 14th century, Samarkand was so wealthy and so important that a conqueror named Tamerlane, who controlled an empire stretching from India to the Mediterranean, decided not to expand his empire further. Instead, he made Samarkand his capital. Why? Because controlling Samarkand gave him more power and more wealth than maintaining his sprawling empire. He invested enormous resources into making it even more spectacular. He built Registan Square, which features 3 madrasas religious schools with turquoise tiles that still gleam in the sun today. These weren't just buildings. They were advertisements of wealth and power. Then there's Kashgar, sitting right on the border between China and Central Asia. Kashgar was essentially the gateway between the Chinese world and the Western world. Everything going in had to go through Kashgar. Everything going out had to go through Kashgar. That gave Kashgar absolute control over commerce. The city became so wealthy and so important that multiple empires fought over it. Chinese dynasties wanted to control it. Persian kingdoms wanted it. Turkish tribes wanted it. Eventually, Mongols conquered it. But no matter who controlled it politically, merchants kept coming because there was nowhere else to go. And then there's Chang'an, modern-day Xi'an, which was the eastern terminus of the Silk Road and also the capital of several Chinese dynasties. At its height during the Tang Dynasty, Chang'an had over 1 million people, making it one of the largest cities in the world. It was so cosmopolitan, so filled with foreign merchants and traders, that it became like an international hub. You had merchants from Persia, from Rome, from India, and from Central Asia, all living in Chang'an. They brought their religions, their cultures, and their trade goods. The city became so enriched by this commerce that it became not just a city, but a symbol of power and wealth. There's also Merv in modern-day Turkmenistan. A 10th century geographer called it the mother of the world. And get this, in the early 13th century, Merv was the largest city in the world, larger than Baghdad, larger than Chang'an, larger than anything in Europe. Over 500,000 people live in one city in the middle of the desert. A desert city, that shouldn't be possible. But Merv was so wealthy, so important to trade, that it attracted people from everywhere. They built irrigation systems to feed the city. They created marketplaces where fortunes changed hands daily. Then Genghis Khan showed up and basically destroyed the entire city. But that's another story. Now let's talk about what happened when all this money showed up. Because this is where these cities became genuinely more powerful than the empires around them. When you're an empire, money has to be divided up. You need to pay the armies. You need to build fortifications. You need to maintain roads for military purposes. You need to fund government bureaucracy. You need to support a capital city and its court. The money gets spread thin because empire building is expensive. But when you're a trading city, money comes directly to merchants and traders. These merchants then spend that money in the city. They need food, so they buy from local farmers and vendors. They need places to stay, so they rent from landlords. They need their goods repaired, so they pay craftsmen. They need entertainment, so they support artists, musicians, and scholars. That money circulates through the entire city. A merchant who sells silk buys wine, a wine merchant buys fruit, a fruit seller buys cloth, a cloth merchant buys spices. Everyone gets rich. Everyone prospers. And this is crucial. The wealthier the merchants become, the more they invest in the city itself. Why? Because they're living there. They're raising their families there. They want their children to be educated. They want beautiful buildings. They want security. So wealthy merchants started funding madrasas, religious schools that became centers of learning. They funded observatories where astronomers studied the stars. They funded hospitals where doctors innovated new treatments. They funded libraries. They funded mosques and temples. They created public baths. These weren't vanity projects. Well, some of them were, but they also serve a practical purpose. They made the city more attractive to merchants. If you're a trader deciding between two cities to conduct your business, you'll pick the one with better education, better security, better facilities, and better culture. So cities competed with each other to become more spectacular, more learned, and more cultured. Samarkand and Baghdad competed. Kashgar and Bukhara competed. Each city tried to outdo the others in terms of wealth and sophistication. Here's where we get to the really subversive part of this story. Empires are built on control. An emperor controls territory. An emperor controls people. An emperor commands armies. An emperor decides taxes. An empire is fundamentally hierarchical. But cities that got rich through trade, they operated on a different logic entirely. Merchants needed freedom. They needed to be able to negotiate deals without a bureaucrat taxing every transaction. They needed to be able to take risks without an emperor's permission. They needed networks that operated independently of imperial control. So here's what happened. These trading cities developed their own political structures, often completely outside of or independent from the empires that nominally controlled them. Merchants formed guilds, basically professional associations that regulated their own trade. They created their own law codes, often more merchant-friendly than imperial law. They established their own security forces to protect caravans and goods. Some of these merchant cities became so autonomous that they were effectively city-states. They paid taxes to whatever empire nominally ruled them, but they made their own decisions about commerce, about justice, and about foreign policy. This created an interesting problem for emperors. The Han Dynasty in China needed those cities because they generated incredible wealth. That wealth funded the imperial court. That wealth paid for armies. But the cities were also independent power centers that the emperor couldn't fully control. The Persian Empire faced the same problem. Rome faced it too. Imperial governments needed the wealth generated by trade, but they couldn't actually command the merchants to make that wealth happen. You can't force someone to trade. You can't force merchants to bring goods to your territory. If the city becomes too oppressive, merchants just start going around it. They find another route. They trade through a different city. And the cities knew this. They had leverage. A city like Samarkand or Kashgar could essentially tell an emperor, if you tax our merchants too heavily, they'll find another route and you'll get nothing. It's not that the cities defied empires directly. It's that they had a kind of structural power that made empires dependent on them. The emperor couldn't simply command them into submission without killing the goose that laid the golden egg. But here's another dimension to this story that's even more interesting than money. Ideas. These cities didn't just become wealthy in terms of gold and goods. They became the intellectual and cultural capitals of the world. And in many ways, that power exceeded their wealth. Why? Because merchants traveling the Silk Road weren't just transporting goods. They were transporting ideas, technologies, religions, and philosophies. Buddhist monks from India traveled along the routes and spread Buddhism throughout Central Asia and China. Islamic scholars traveled from the Middle East and brought their learning to Central Asia. These ideas didn't just pass through. They took root in the cities. Samarkand became a center of Islamic learning. Kashgar became a center of Buddhist learning. Chang'an became so culturally diverse that it created new forms of art, new schools of thought, and new ways of understanding the world. And this is important. Intellectual power became a form of wealth as significant as commercial wealth. A city that had the best scholars, the best astronomers, the best philosophers, and the best historians. That city attracted more merchants because merchants wanted to do business with educated, cultured people. They wanted their families to have access to the best education. Ambitious men wanted to study in cities with famous universities, so cities invested heavily in intellectual institutions. Ulugh Beg, who ruled Samarkand in the 15th century, was an astronomer and mathematician. He founded observatories and universities. He didn't do this to make money directly. He did it because a culturally significant city was a powerful city. A city known for learning and discovery was more important on the world stage than a city that was just rich. Merv, before it was destroyed, was known not just for trade but for being a center of philosophy and science. Baghdad became famous for its House of Wisdom, where scholars from across the Islamic world worked on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. These cities became the think tanks of the ancient world. They became the places where new ideas were synthesized, where technologies from China like papermaking and printing were adopted and then spread westward, where Indian mathematical concepts like the number zero and the decimal system moved into the Islamic world and then into Europe. The cities were nodes in a vast network of human knowledge and creativity, and that made them powerful in ways that money alone never could. Now, here's the dark part of the story. These cities didn't last forever. By the 15th century, the age of the Silk Road was ending. Maritime trade became more important than overland trade. Portuguese and Spanish explorers found sea routes to Asia that were faster and cheaper than the old routes. The political fragmentation of Central Asia made the Silk Road less safe. Some of the great cities declined. Samarkand became less important. Kashgar faded. Baghdad had already been sacked by the Mongols centuries earlier. But here's what's fascinating. The legacy never died. These cities proved something fundamental, that commerce and culture could be sources of power equal to or greater than military conquest, that a city could become more important than an empire through trade and learning, that merchants could exercise political influence not through violence, but through the simple fact that empires needed them. And that pattern repeats throughout history. Venice became a superpower not through conquest, but through trade. The Dutch became a global power through commerce. These weren't ancient anomalies. They were examples of a principle, that control of commerce gives you power. Those centers of learning and culture give you power. These forms of power can be as significant or more significant than military power. So to answer the original question, how did the Silk Road make cities richer than empires? The answer isn't complicated, but it's important. These cities became essential nodes in a global supply chain. They provided services that merchants needed. They attracted people and capital through commerce and culture. They developed independent institutions and infrastructure. And most importantly, they existed in the space where empires depended on them more than they depended on empires. The merchants, traders, scholars, and craftspeople who lived in these cities didn't overthrow empires. They didn't rebel. They didn't need to. They simply became too important to be controlled. And that, in the end, is the most interesting form of power. Not the power to command, but the power to be indispensable.